what I've been asked to talk to you about today is something that affects all of us, and that's how to make better decisions. So someone obviously looked up my business and thought I was going to talk about data, but we're going to talk about mindset. So the reason I'm here, it's on the screen, is I wrote a book, The Beekeeper's Guide to Building a Team. You may have also seen it under the title, How to Succeed in Apiculture. It's the same book. We've been testing titles, just like you should be in your business, testing ideas all the time. So you can download that book for free and a whole lot of other free resources from our website by scanning that QR code, and there's one on the back as well. So why did I write the book? And that's a great question, and I'm glad you asked. Yeah. So through my business, as I said before, I've worked with commercial beekeepers around the world. I have customers on, I think, 5 continents. And many of my clients simply didn't know where to start when it comes to developing systems to scale their business, grow their team, as it's very easy to get stuck working in the business rather than working on it. Cool, so where we're at, there's been lots of talk today about Varroa, and I'm not here to talk about Varroa, but we're in a world that's changing biologically, politically and economically, and doing more of the same won't cut it any longer. You know, the famous quote that goes, "What got you here won't get you there," by Marshall Goldsmith, and I think that really captures exactly where we're at in our industry right now. Between low global commodity prices for honey, drought and the arrival of Varroa, we're facing a perfect storm, and many of us are running harder just to stand still. But what if the problem wasn't how we're working, but how we're thinking? So today it's not about hive tips or field tricks, it's about mindset and how to make better business decisions. So let's be honest with ourselves. Most of us, myself included, we probably got into business. Didn't get into business, I should say, because we loved spreadsheets or because we wanted to, had the dream of managing people. We became business owners because we wanted to be our own boss. Maybe you couldn't work with the guy that you're under anymore. Maybe you thought you could do it better, and you probably could. That's how you survived to this point, and for some of us, and some of you have done very well. But this same independent mindset that got you started can also be your biggest bottleneck in your business. You stay in the hives because that's what you know, while the business side runs you. You avoid delegation because it feels messy, and you keep flying on gut feel, not data. And what I've learned from my own business, that's not business, that's not entrepreneurship, that's self-employment with extra paperwork. So before we dive into how to make good decisions, I think we should also look at why we make bad ones. So as human beings, we think of ourselves as rational decision makers. However, decades of research in psychology, neuroscience, shows that our thinking is shaped by predictable mental shortcuts, and this leads to errors in judgment. And these are known as cognitive biases. And there's about 6 of them. I'm just going to highlight 3 of them today. And they influence how we interpret information, how we assess risk, form opinions, and I'm sure all of us have got plenty of opinions, and how we interact with others. So the 3 examples I've got on the board there. Most of you probably been beekeeping a very long time, and you're very experienced in your craft and in your field knowledge. But then you also assume that carries over to business decisions. So this is called an overconfidence bias, where we take confidence from one area and apply it to another. You make gut calls based on what's worked before, but the thing with gut calls, and I've found this in my own beekeeping and decision making, but what's actually happening is you're making decisions based on what's easiest to recall at the time. This is called availability heuristics. And I think a big one is you resist change because this challenges your identity as a self-reliant operator, ignoring or discounting information that challenges existing beliefs, and you look for data that supports what you already believe. So confirmation bias and the fear of discomfort. And here's the kicker. The more experienced you are, the more likely these traps catch you out because you trust your gut too much. So a couple of examples of overconfidence bias in beekeeping. So let me ask you this, a little bit of audience interaction. How many of you make decisions based on how much money is in your bank account today? Not based on a cash flow forecast, not based on a budget, but just what's in there now. Who can be caught doing that? I think a few hands going up. I think some of you are probably being more stubborn or have a bit of pride, but I certainly, when I started my business, it's something that caught me out. This is called bank account accountancy, and it's the equivalent of driving a truck by only looking in the rear vision mirror. We're not accountants, but our overconfidence from other areas, thinks we can get away with it. And this particular cognitive bias actually has a name called the Dunning-Kruger effect, after those that studied it. It's where we overestimate our competence from one area and apply it to another area of low ability. And what makes things worse, not only do we perform poorly in these areas, but we lack the self-awareness to recognise our own shortcomings, making it difficult to learn and improve. Fortunately, in my own case, especially with starting this business, as I had a board, I had some outside oversight by the shareholders that came in, and we quickly rectified the problem by bringing in financial services and management reporting. But in the 6 months leading up to that, I was running my business based on knowing what's coming in or what was due to come in 1 month and sort of balancing our expenses. By making this one change with management reporting, it probably de-stressed me the most. It gave me an 18-month roadmap of where our cash flow would be, which also then helped us really identify the goals and challenges we needed to face. And this is where mentorship by those that have succeeded before you and professional services are important to point out our own blind spots. Another example of cognitive bias I found in beekeeping within my own clients. So if you talk to most beekeepers around hive deaths and why they've lost hives, the common answers you'll get are queen problems or varroa. As you can tell, I'm mainly talking to New Zealand or American clients. But however, once we actually measured the reasons for hive deaths over the years, it became obvious through quite a few of our clients that yes, queen problems and varroa are common issues for hive colony loss, but up to 50% of the losses were due to other reasons, a big one being starvation or overwinter chilling. And starvation, you could also interpret that as nutrition. But once these things are identified, some of these easy ones, especially around nutrition and overwintering losses due to just chilling, basic management practices can be adopted, and then you can easily cut that loss in half, which has a huge impact on your bottom line, not having to do that re-establishment every year. So I guess this brings me to how do we make better decisions? So to make better decisions, generally, I think we can all agree that we need to be better informed. But typically I see two types of beekeepers. Those that have no record keeping whatsoever, so you're running on gut, and you've got maybe decades of experience, and you've learnt as you have recognised patterns over those years. But this is a very slow method of learning, and then when we have, which is great in a stable business and operating environment, when we have a step change which is coming now, this is where it can trip you up. Yeah? And I also see those that go in the opposite direction, tracking every minute detail at a hive level, or treating every hive as an individual, tracking things like what queen's in each hive, who was the supplier, when was it replaced, how long it was maybe the new queen was in the cage before it was replaced, but then miss the big stuff around hiring right, training, how to price your services, and cash flow timing. Yeah? It's very easy to get trapped perfecting your craft and being a good operator, but being a good operator doesn't make you a good business owner. And both lead to the same outcome over time, being slow to adapt to change, especially when we're facing a crisis like now. Australia is not unique. I guess the crisis you are now seeing is with low honey prices and varroa, but the rest of the world sees the exact same problems. Honey sector in general is in a crisis globally, world around. So if you don't take action early, stress will mount, and eventually this can lead to becoming overwhelmed if you haven't got a plan in place. And once you become overwhelmed, it's very hard to adapt. But a little stress is good. In fact, it can be useful. It sharpens our focus, It heightens our awareness and often pushes us to act when we've been stuck. But it's not just about having more information. We have lots of information available to us these days. It's about the right information and how do we distill that information down to what's important. Having balance between being informed across having balance and being informed across all elements of our business. And unfortunately, this is the exception, not the norm in beekeeping. That's why I've been asked here today to come put a firecracker under your asses. I actually run 2 software businesses in the agri sector, and so one in beekeeping, that's why I'm here today, but I also have a software business looking after agricultural contractors, similar products. What I see is there's a vast difference between beekeepers and agricultural contractors when it comes to business processes and business acumen. And the contractors, I think what some of them earn would make you cry. There's a huge difference in the way their businesses are operated and therefore the outcomes. So here's the truth. If you're stuck, it's not your staff's fault, it's not the market, it's not the government's fault. Blaming others or having an external locus of control is not going to fix anything. And ignorance is a state of being unaware, but ignorance does not simply mean a lack of knowledge or education, but a refusal to learn and upgrade yourself. So to change, you need to adopt an internal locus of control, the belief that we shape our outcomes and acknowledge the cognitive biases and become more willing to participate in productive discussions and gain deeper insights. So, and psychologist Daniel Kahneman introduces this thinking of 2 types of thinking, which is on the wall now. So system 1 is fast, automatic and intuitive. It's useful for routine decisions, but relies on mental shortcuts. So gut feel, emotional patterns, therefore is vulnerable to cognitive bias, as fast thinking is done by our limbic brain. We have 3 brains. And because it's in our limbic brain, our small brain in the middle, it's cognitively limited. Yeah? And then system 2 thinking is slow, analytical and more deliberate, less prone to error, but requires more mental effort, and is done by our neurocortex brain. So the system 1 thinking, this is our default method of operating, often used for quick decision making in everyday situations with little or no effort, but relies on heuristics, so things that, again, we can recall easily and quickly, and which explains why it's prone to common errors, even among intelligent and experienced individuals. But business thinking requires system 2, slow, deliberate, and analytical thinking. So going back to how do we make those better business decisions, I have 3 key things we can take away. Build a thinking environment. Get others involved. Get perspective from outside your own echo chamber. Find a mentor. And I recommend finding a mentor outside of beekeeping. Talk to a business mentoring group. There's plenty of them around. In my own journey, I seeked out and found a mentorship group to start my own business and get that external insight. Seek feedback from your second-tier managers. And if you don't have a second-tier management within your business, my book that I'll put up again, we have a whole chapter dedicating to why that's important in your business. And engage professional services, so financial advisors, bookkeepers, but more importantly, people that will challenge your thinking. You don't want yes men, you want people that will question why are we doing something. I quite like the quote, which might have been on the previous slide, attributed to Einstein. I don't know if it actually is, but if I had an hour to solve a problem, I'd spend 55 minutes thinking about the problem and 5 minutes solving it. I mean, quite often we jump to a conclusion way too quickly and we haven't actually thought about what's the problem we're actually solving. And the third approach you need to do is use systems. So SOPs, the standard operating procedure, dashboards, record-keeping software, and financial tools. So having systems doesn't replace experience, it enhances it. Systems are your shortcuts to fast learning, distilling vast quantities of information down to what's important, and particularly standard operating procedure. I think there's one thing that I see lacking a lot in beekeeping, and again, you can download a free resource to get you started from our website. Is one of the most useful tools in teaching new staff and is a great shortcut to the accelerated learning. But first, you also need to do the learning to develop your SOPs. So you should experiment and test new ideas on small groups of hives, not your entire operation, because this could lead to disaster or becoming overwhelmed with the amount of data, but doing small trials on groups of colonies and working out what works best. And once you've learned what works, create an SOP as a shortcut to repeating that process, so getting a predictable, repeatable outcome without the need to go into detailed record keeping all the time. The goal here is not perfection, it's progress. And the people who win are the ones that take the time to think, test, and adapt. A good example of this in varroa control and treating, you might look at your varroa treatments, for example, is I want to just pick out one around formic acid, for example. I think a well-known thing with formic acid is that it can be very harsh on queens. But if you already have, for example, an autumn requeening regime, you can use this to your advantage. So a lot of beekeepers, particularly young beekeepers that have been thinking and adapting, if they're going to requeen but they also have high mite levels, why not use formic acid? A, it will knock the mite levels down quick, but it will also, in a lot of cases, wipe out the existing queen. So when it comes to requeening, the acceptance rate is a lot higher. So getting a double win by just being clever and thinking about how you apply something. So turning a downside into a positive. So the last one. So you probably got, into beekeeping because you love the work. But if the business runs you, you will burn out or eventually go broke, especially when there's a step change in the operating conditions that you're now facing. To win, you need to adapt an internal locus of control, start implementing the systems that I've mentioned, and get the right people involved to help you distill the vast quantities of information you should be recording down to a few key metrics that you can track. This then frees your cognitive ability up to slow down and think and work out what really matters and where to go to next. What you've done in the past probably isn't going to work going forward. You're definitely going to have to adapt your hive management practices and what honey flows you might go to, etc. So if some of what I've said today resonates with you, here are the 3 things you should do this week to get started. Pick one metric to track and track it consistently. Delegate or automate one task that eats your time and schedule 1 to 2 hours of dedicated, distraction-free thinking. Because you're not, you're not just running hives. If you're a business owner, you're here to build a business, and a business needs a CEO, not just another guy in a bee suit. So, you will win at whatever you do, and even if you take nothing away from today, you'll win at that too. So, thank you very much.